I'm Dr. David Adams. In this session, we're going to be focusing on reading and preaching from miracle texts, especially focusing on the miracles of Jesus. We'll approach this in three parts. The first part will be a very brief introduction to the problem and also a bit of a definition of exactly what we mean by a miracle. But I'd like to begin with a question. The question is this: given the frequency of miracles in the Gospels, why is there so little, relatively speaking, preaching on them in the churches? Well, there might be more than one answer to that question, but one answer might be that preachers are hesitant to promise what they can't deliver. If they themselves are not miracle workers, how can they preach on miracles that might suggest to some people that they could expect miracles to come about in their daily life? The second reason that some preachers undoubtedly hesitate to preach miracles is a certain skepticism about the miraculous. That is to say, even many conservative Christians feel just a little bit uncomfortable emphasizing God's going against the laws of nature sometimes. And frankly, I think even some conservative Christians have somewhat compromised with the spirit of the world in this sense. The third reason, and I think this may be actually the most common, is that many preachers are simply uncertain about how to preach on miracle text appropriately. You see, miracle texts create a certain problem for preachers. Whether one follows a set of lectionary readings or one just picks a text on any given Sunday on which to preach, we tend to encounter miracles as self-contained narratives that are separated from the larger context of the book in which they're located. So we see them as individual, isolated incidents rather than events that are well integrated into the broader story that's unfolding before us. This means that because those who hear sermons in the pews hear them one at a time, they often hear a text in which Jesus seems to just fix something. There's something wrong, Jesus comes along and fixes it, and everything is better. As a result of that, when you encounter them just one at a time without connections between them, they eventually all kind of start to sound the same. And that's really a problem for preachers. How do you preach miracle texts in a way that's faithful to the text and yet rich for the listeners, and that enriches the listener's understanding of what's actually happening in the biblical stories? So this problem that after a while, all miracle text sermons can kind of start to sound the same poses the question that we want to consider in these sessions. And that is, how can we better understand the role of miracles in the Bible, and how can we preach them more effectively? So, our goals for this session are to walk through the process of moving from reading a miracle text to understanding it, and then to framing and preaching a sermon. And we want to do this by looking at a number of different theological frameworks that can serve as the basis for our understanding the text and for proclaiming it. So here's how we're going to go about this. We're going to begin with an introduction to the problem, which basically we've already done, and spend just a moment more on the definition of miracles. Then in the second part of this session, we're going to take a look at some theological and literary frameworks that will help us read and preach from miracle texts. And then in the third session, we'll take a look at an actual example. So let's begin by looking at the question, what is a miracle? Now, there are a variety of ways we could approach this question, and we don't want to make this an in-depth study on miracles themselves. So perhaps the easiest way to get at this is to go back to the first events in the Bible that are actually referred to as miracles. And that would be the 10 plagues in the book of Exodus. The plague narrative contains the first description of events that are specifically designated as miracles in the Bible. Now, you might argue that there are other miracles before that, such as creation. That would be largely an argument over how we define these things. But there's no doubt that the plague narratives give us the first events that are actually called miracles by the Bible themselves. And we want to look at 3 different words that are used in Hebrew and in Greek to talk about miracles. The first of these is the Hebrew word oath, usually translated by the Greek term semeon. An oath is really a sign. It's an indicator or the mark of something, even the mark of ownership. But basically, the function of an oath is to point to something else. In other words, an oath directs the one who sees it or hears it, perceives it, to see something beyond the oath itself, something that's represented by that action. And so oath is really, in that sense, a functional term. It emphasizes the function that's being performed. So let's ask ourselves, what is the function that's being performed in the plague narratives? Well, here we don't have to guess because the Bible tells us very specifically. In Exodus 9, verse 14, God says to Pharaoh, "For this time I will send all my plagues on you yourself and on your servants and your people, so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth." So here, the function of the sign is to indicate to Pharaoh the uniqueness of Israel's God. And then a couple of verses later, he continues, "For this purpose I have raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth." St. Paul quotes this in the book of Romans as well. In chapter 10, we get a similar thought. God, this time speaking to Moses, says, "Go in, for I've hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and grandson how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord." So again, the function of the sign here is to reveal who Yahweh is. In chapter 12, we have another insight. God says, "I will pass through the land of Egypt that night and will strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh." So, the function of an oath, one function of an oath at least, and the function that's mentioned most often in the plague narratives, is that these signs, these events, are pointers to demonstrate to both Israel and to Egypt who God is. Along with that, they also serve as signs to point to what God is doing. So these 2 elements of demonstrating who God is and pointing what God is doing are the primary functions of an oath in the Old Testament, a sign in the Old Testament. But oath isn't the only word that's used to talk about these. Another important Hebrew word in this respect is the word mopheth. Mopheth is usually translated in Greek by the word teras, and it too can refer to a sign much like oath, but it has a slightly different connotation. It has more of a connotation of not only pointing to the something else, but doing so in such a way that it creates a certain response in the viewer, an amazement, a sense of wonder or awe. And so there's a different aspect to slightly different aspect to mofaith than there is to oath. The third word goes a little farther in that direction, and that's the Hebrew word niflaoth. Niflaoth, usually translated by the Greek thaumasia, or thaumasia, here, the emphasis is not on pointing to something else at all. The emphasis is primarily on the impact of the event upon the viewer. And so this word is usually translated something like to wonder at or to marvel at. A niflaoth is something that causes this response of wonder or marvelment. And so miracle is a fine translation, although it doesn't necessarily communicate what distinguishes a niflaoth from just an oath. So, generally speaking then, there are two types of miracles in the Bible. If we look at all the miracles, not just in the book of Exodus, but across the Bible, we'll see that they generally fall into two categories. The first category are things that we would think of as natural processes of nature that become miraculous either because of their timing or the speed at which they happen or the extent that they happen. So, for example, just to take one of these from the plague narrative, let's say the plague of locusts. Well, locust plagues are not particularly unique. We have them right now going on in the world these days, and some great large plagues of locusts have been apparent here around the world in our generation any number of times. What makes the plague of locusts in the book of Exodus distinctive is that God told Moses he was going to do it at a certain time, and it had a great extent, and it developed very quickly. So it's really a natural process. It's something that happens normally according to the laws of nature. It just happened in a unique and distinctive way. That's one kind of miracle. The second kind of miracle are things that are simply not really explainable within the laws of nature. That is to say, there is no easy, natural explanation that can capture the event and explain it. And these are sometimes problematic for modern hearers because modern hearers want to find a natural explanation for everything to explain how God is working. But there are some things that God does, like raising people from the dead, that just do not have any naturalistic explanation. They are not explicable within the laws of nature. Now, either one of these kinds of miracles, either the natural processes that are miraculous because of the way they happen, or events that are not explainable by the laws of nature, either one of these can function in the way of pointing out who God is and indicating what God is doing. So it doesn't matter which kind of miracle God employs. The point is to recognize the function that it's performing of indicating who God is and what God is doing in the world. So that's our quick look at an introduction of the problem and a definition of miracles. In our next segment, we'll take up how to use theological and literary frameworks for reading and preaching miracle texts. I'm Dr. David Adams. Thank you for joining me for this study.